So welcome. We're going to talk about the amazing magic capabilities of CA Dynamic Capacity Intelligence, which I will probably hereafter refer to as DCI because I'm lazy. Right, so I'm Lowell Higley. I'm a product manager for CA, and I manage a lot of products, and I interact with a lot of products that I don't even manage. So, comes from a lot of various backgrounds. All right. So, obligatory legal slide. The presentation I'm about to give obligates the company to nothing, and this is for informational purposes only. So, those of you that attended some of my other presentations, I've had a couple of presentations this week. I had one earlier this morning, and I also had a more detailed technical deep dive. I believe it was on Monday afternoon. If you attended either of those presentations, some of the slides are going to look familiar. I reused some of the content, but there is some new content here as well, particularly if you attended my presentation this morning. Right. So here's what we're going to talk about. What's the problem we're trying to solve with DCI? Then I'm going to talk a little bit about limiting capacity, and then I'm going to talk about DCI itself as a product, and then I'm going to talk about limiting capacity versus managing capacity. What's the difference, and why is managing capacity more important than limiting capacity? And at that point, I'm going to wrap it up, ask if you guys have any questions, and if you don't, we'll move on and we'll all leave Las Vegas and have a good afternoon. Otherwise, I will sit here and I will answer all your questions. All right, so what's the problem we're trying to solve, right? So those of you this morning saw this, there's two opposing thoughts of school here, right? So I need to save money, or I need to make sure my SLAs, my service level agreements, get completed, achieved. They seem like similar goals, but sometimes you can't achieve them at the same time. It's either one or the other. I either save money or I meet my SLAs, right? So there are opposing forces at work here. So how do we solve this problem? How do we meet our SLAs and lower our costs at the same time? How do we lower those MLC costs? Well, introducing DCI, or hopefully DCI solves this problem for you. Right, we want to provide guaranteed service. We want to make sure that we meet these SLAs, right? So there's a paradox here, versus minimizing licensing cost. With DCI, we want to be able to do both. We want you to meet your SLAs, and we want you to do it at the minimum or lowest cost possible. All right, capacity limits, right? Who in the audience currently limits their capacities? Anybody limit their capacities either through defined capacity or group capacity limits? 1, 2, 3. All right. So how does that work for you? Work okay? Is it manual? Okay. All right. So let's talk about limiting capacity, right? So by limiting capacity, we give the system, or LPAR, we give it a specific limit. You cannot exceed this limit. You've got 55 MSU, 100 MSU, 200 MSU, you shall not exceed this limit, right? So what happens if you have a workload that requires 60 MSU, right, to get done to meet the SLA? Well, with defined capacity limits and group capacity limits, you're probably not going to get that SLA achieved. Right, so let's talk about defined capacity limits, right? So defined capacity limits, you go in, you set some settings, and you let it run, right? And it runs based on those settings that you fire and forget, and it runs on those settings for a period of time, until the next time you come in and change those settings, right? So it's a very manual process, and it limits the R4HA MSU usage of a single LPAR, right? So we're not looking at a KEC, we're not looking at a group, we're not looking at an environment that includes multiple KECs. We're looking at a single LPAR, right? So we're limiting that specific LPAR to a specific number of MSUs for whatever purpose, right? It's not specific, as I meant. It's not flexible, and it needs to be specifically set, as I mentioned, right? And it doesn't particularly look at the capacity needs of your environment right here in the now, right? So like I said, you made those settings, those definitions a while ago, and today, right, it's still running off of those settings that you made a while ago, but your environment may be different and you may have workloads that need more MSUs than your capacity or that your definitions allow, right? So group capacity limits, very similar, right, except a group of LPARs. And that group of LPARs is only on a single KEK. You can't spend KEKs with GCL, with group capacity limits. So very similar, right? So upon reaching the maximum defined MSUs for that specific group, right, it then goes back to your predefined settings, your predefined definitions, and it divvies up the MSUs available based on those definitions, right? So it's not based on what's going on in your environment right here in the now. All right, again, limited to one KEK, and it doesn't allow you to do cross-KEK management of MSUs. All right, so this is a slide that should look familiar from this morning, right? These are all the things that we, in a perfect capping environment or effective low-risk capping environment, that we want our MSU management tool to do, right? We want to limit LPARs, which we can do with group capacity limits, and we can do with defined capacity limits. We want to limit the capacity for a group of LPARs, which we can do with group capacity limits. And we want to run multiple profiles, so multiple policy definitions, which we can also do with group capacity limits and defined capacity limits. But in addition to those things, right, we also want to look at groups of LPARs across LPARs in our entire environment. We want to be able to prioritize LPARs because they run, in general, they run a more critical workload than other LPARs. We want to be able to prioritize MSU capacity flexibly across LPARs and even KEKs based on what's going on right here, now, today, right, in the now. We want to avoid extra costs by slowing down workloads that are not time critical, right? We want to optimize defined capacity by enabling other LPARs to use white space, or white space capacity. And I'll explain what white space is in a little bit, right? We also want to be able to show the capacity usage and the capping situation across the environment in real time, and also allow you to look at it historically. Who's read an SCRT report besides Steph? No one, right? So, all right. So, how much effort is it to read an SCRT report? Not easy, right? So there's a 2 or 3 day course that Cheryl Watson does down in Florida, right? And it takes 3 days to learn how to read an SCRT report. Is that a correct statement? Yeah, okay. So you almost need a PhD to read an SCRT report. Not only that, it's historical, right? So you're getting it a month in arrears, right? You're not looking at it in real time. So when you get that SCRT report, you're looking at the data that's a month old, right? So how can you use that to manage your environment right here, now? Okay. So what's the impact of using group capacity limits and defined capacity limits, right? So it allows us to lower our budget risk, right? We can lower our cost, but the cost of lowering our cost is increased performance risk, right? So we're neglecting those SLAs. That's that dueling priorities that I talked about at the beginning of the presentation, right? So as a result, customers tend not to use capping. They try it out, they tweak it a little bit, and then they wait a month for the SCRT results to come back, and they go, oh man, that drove up my cost, not lowered it, right? So it's very manual and time intensive to go back and forth and tweak those defined capacity and group capacity limits, right? So as a result, CA, dynamic capacity intelligence. All right, so when I first started talking to customers about capacity and saving on MLC or a capacity management tool, I thought in the back of my head that they were all going to say it's all about saving money. Boy, was I wrong, right? So it's not about necessarily saving money. So that is like number 3 on the list of things that customers want to do with the capacity management tool. But their number 1 concern is over here. How do I make sure my important work, my time critical work gets done, right? Never mind about the cost for now. I want to make sure the work gets done, right? So with DCI, we're trying to make sure that you have a tool to get those SLAs met and get the work done, your time critical work. So the next thing, the number 2 thing that customers said, again, not about cost really, it's about how do I identify capacity that I may be spending not so wisely, how can I recover that capacity and use it for other things? Either in my test dev environment, either for net new workloads. How can I identify capacity and reuse it and bring on net new workloads, for example, and not have to pay IBM more money, right? So that was the number 2 thing that customers said. The number 3 thing, ta-da, cost, right? So that was the third thing that customers said that they want to do with a capacity management tool is save money, right? So DCI, we want to allow you to do these 3 things, and the tool will hopefully, depending on your environment, allow you to do these 3 things, right? Make sure you get your SLAs met, recover capacity for new workloads or moving capacity to your developers or your testers, and lower your costs. Right, so very quickly, again, this is a repeat slide from this morning. How does DCI work, right? So in this environment, we have 1 KEK and 2 LPARs in the KEK, very simple. We have a mixture of batch and online jobs. So a point of order, I guess, DCI doesn't care whether your workloads are batch or online. It works the same way. We have no knowledge, no insight as to what your actual workloads are. All we look is at the importance level and the time criticality that you set to that importance level within the DCI policy. Other than that, we have no idea what's running on that LPAR, right? So what we do is we move capacity to the work. We don't move the work to the capacity, we move the capacity to the work. We think it's a better approach. So how does it work? Right, so in this environment, I have 200 MSUs total, 100 in each LPAR in the beginning. And then, again, LPAR 1 has a critical workload, just happens to be batch. And then we have 5 other workloads running, which are not time critical or routine, however you want to think about it. So, on each LPAR that's being managed by DCI, we have an agent. It's a very lightweight agent. All that agent is doing is gathering WLM information and sending it to the DCI controller, right? Just giving it data about what's going on in the environment every 15 seconds. That's what's drawing the picture for our near real-time reports that gives you the pretty graphics and the reports about your MSU usage and R4HA, rolling 4-hour average. All right. So every 5 minutes, the DCI, with all that information it's been collecting over the 5 minutes, it kind of goes, what's going on in the environment? Well, I have 1 critical workload that's running on LPAR 1 that doesn't seem to have enough capacity to meet its SLA objective, right? So it goes through the process of moving the capacity from LPAR 2, which has extra capacity, to LPAR 1. How does it do that? So it sends a message. The controller sends a message to the appropriate LPARs that says, through the BCPII API, LPAR 2, tell the HMC that you want to give up X amount of MSUs, right? So basically, we're lowering the defined cap here, and we're raising the defined cap here, right? So we're automating the defined cap settings for that specific LPAR. I will pause here for any questions. Okay. All right, so limiting capacity versus managing capacity, right? So defined capacity limits and group capacity limits do an awesome job at limiting capacity. But my contention is that we don't want to just limit capacity, we want to manage capacity, right? So with DCI, we allow you to manage capacity. How do we do that? So we do it with when we designed the product, how did we do it? We used 4 design tenets, right? So we want to prioritize MSU allocation for the critical workloads. So we want to make sure the MSUs are where they need to be, right? So the product has to do that. It has to be simple to use, right? If it's hard to use, if it requires a lot of settings, a lot of customization, group capacity limits and defined capacity limits have pretty much proved it that you're not going to use it. Maximum flexibility. It has to work in a range of environments. It has to work no matter whether you have one KEK or six sysplexes, right? It doesn't matter, right? It needs to work in all those environments. It needs to be flexible based on what your environment, what your pricing model is. Are you on a country multiplex pricing? Are you on some other pricing model? Are you going to get a Z14 or a Z14 and use container-based pricing, right? We need to take all that stuff into mind. We need to manage that for you or help you manage it. And then real-time capacity insights. We talked about the SCRT report a little bit earlier, right? So that's a month in arrear and allows you to see what's going on in your environment, but it's a month too late, right? So with real-time capacity insights, those pictures we give you, those reports, right? You can see in real time what's going on in your environment. So through that, we create, and through the DCI tool, you can create balancing policy definitions. So those policy definitions have 5 characteristics, right? They have to be valid, right? So for a policy to be running, it has to be running, right? That's what makes it valid. It's on or off. If that policy is in effect, it's valid, right? We need to define groups, right? So for example, in a group capacity limit situation, if I have a group defined, all of my LPARs are on a single KEK. But with DCI, I can define those groups across KEKs, right? So I can have 2 LPARs on KEK 1, I can have 5 LPARs on KEK 2, right? It doesn't matter where they're at, we can still define those group definitions in a single definition, right? And span the KEKs. MSU range definition, a min and a max. How much does that LPAR need or that group need at any given time as a dead minimum? And then, as a maximum to that range, what is the absolute maximum number of MSUs that we want to make available to that group or that LPAR? LPAR categorization, right? I talked a little bit about time criticality. We want to be able to tell you, we want to be able to define in that policy how critical that workload is. Workload categorization. We want to be able to define, to categorize the workloads based on importance level, through WLM, through the time criticality, et cetera, right? High, medium, low, if you attend the WLM session right before this one. All right, so validity. Basically, when is it active, right? So this is a typical example of what a customer would have in their environment as far as policies. You've got an online policy for Monday through Friday, 7 a.m. To 5 p.m. You have a batch policy, Monday through Friday, 7 a.m. to 5 p.m. Then you have a weekend policy. You might have a night policy for batch and online, right? So these are different kinds of policies you can have. You might have an emergency policy, which basically removes all restrictions and capping is not going on, right? And that's all can be done through simple commands of the 3270, right? And we also include business calendar functionality. So if you have a holiday or something like that, a day, a special event, those kinds of things. All right, so in the following slides, I'm going to go through a couple scenarios of what a balancing policy looks like. Right, so in my scenario, this is my, my setup. This is my example environment. So I've got 2 KEKs, and on those 2 KEKs, I have 7 LPARs. On KEK 1, I have 3 LPARs. On KEK 2, I have 4 LPARs. So I've created 3 subgroup policies within DCI. And you'll notice that these subgroups have traditional ZOS workloads. And you'll also notice that the groups span the KEKs, right? So in group 1, I have 1 LPAR on KEK 1 and 2 groups on KEK 2. In group 2, subgroup 2, I have 1 in each KEK, and so on. So 3 subgroups total with 7 LPARs total across 2 KEKs. All right. So this is a table version of what you would see in the 3270. It's very similar. It's actually in the 3270. This is broken across 2 screens. But very similar look and feel, just without all the colors and boxes. All right, so this is a standard definition for the 2 KEK environment, and you'll notice we have lots of information here, which I'll go into in the next following slides. All right, so the first thing I want to talk about is total MSU range. So for the entire environment, everything in my environment that I am managing with DCI, I have a min and a max MSU value, right? So at no time can my environment exceed 920 MSU. I have a min MSU. So at any time, the environment has at least 820 MSUs available to it. All right, subgroups. Here's my subgroup 1, subgroup 2, subgroup 3. And you notice it also has min and max definitions, right? So subgroup 1, minimum 460, maximum 650, on down the line, right? And you'll also notice that I have definitions for each LPAR within the subgroup. Quick math, 300, 160, 460. On down the line. I got ahead of myself. So each LPAR has its own MSU ranges as well. All right, so time criticality. I keep talking about time criticality. What the heck does that mean? So WLM, Workload Manager, gives you importance levels. Importance levels 0 through 5, and then discretionary. So you would define your workloads as the importance to get that work done. So let's put that in a little bit of an SLA perspective. If my enterprise had an SLA for audit reports, right? So everybody has compliance requirements, everybody has audit reports or compliance reports that they need to provide to their auditors, compliance managers, whatever, right? Risk management. So a typical SLA would be that by the 10th business day of the month, I need to deliver to that compliance department those audit reports. If I set that as an importance level 1 or an importance level 2 even, right, the chances are that that workload is going to get a high initiator and it's going to get spit out on my busiest day of the month and consume those MIPS, or those MSU, probably the day that I want it the least, right? So it's important work, but is it time critical, right? By time critical, I mean, does it have to get done, no kidding, right now, today? Well, if my SLA is the 10th business day of the month, no, not really. All right, so business critical. Slowdown should be avoided at all costs. This work has to get done, no kidding, right? Time critical. Slowdown should be avoided, but it can occur towards the end of a 5-minute period, right? So if we're tapering off towards that 5-minute interval that we're looking and adjusting workloads, we might be able to slow it down a little bit. Non-time critical workload, we can slow it down, but only if it saves us money. If it doesn't save us money, there's no point in slowing down that workload. All right, so each WLM importance level in each LPAR is defined individually, right? So in the console, right, you will have a column to define importance level for each LPAR, as well as for each LPAR. The only exception is importance level 0. Importance level 0, by default, is always going to be business critical. You can't change that, no exceptions, right? Kind of makes sense though, right? I'm hoping. All right. So like I talked about a few minutes ago, every 15 seconds, those agents are sending the data about the workload to the controller. And then every 5 minutes, the controller gathers all that data up, kind of goes through a process and makes a decision. So in 3 steps, we determine how the workload needs to be moved around, or I'm sorry, not how the workload needs to be moved around, how the capacity needs to be moved around to get the workloads to meet their SLAs at the minimum cost possible. Right, so step 1. Within each group, DCI will allocate the capacity per LPAR to business critical workloads first, or business critical LPARs first, right? So it'll go down the list, right? Okay, so all these things are business critical. So of the available capacity, it'll go here first. Make sense? Okay. Step 2. Then we look at time critical workloads. So at this point, we start giving capacity to time critical workloads based on importance level, which is already in there, and the time critical that we put on top of the importance levels, right? right, so next, step 3. Obviously, intuitively, we look at non-time critical workloads. If there is capacity available for non-time critical workloads, at that point, we give that capacity to those workloads. Let me grab a drink of water real quick. So at this point, I'm going to pause for a second and ask if there's any questions. Okay. I'm doing a really good job then. Or really bad, one of the two. All right. So, we also, CA/DCI also balances workloads between, balances capacity between the groups, right? So we've got 3 groups here. So we look at the group as a whole, and you'll notice between business critical and time critical, there's one group that seems to have a lot more business critical than another group, right? So that's the winner, and it would get the capacity between those 2 groups first, right? So this leads to MLC software, savings in MLC software that can run in both groups, in this case, ZOS and DB2. All right, so another feature is we can also give you we can give you high, medium, low, so you can assign a type to that particular LPAR in addition, so more granularity in addition to the business critical, time critical, non-time critical. And it ranges from unmanaged all the way down to low. All right, so before I talked about something called white space capping or white space capacity. So we do that through white space capping. So basically what this means, sometimes if we set a defined cap or a group capacity limit, and there really isn't a need for one, let's say the rolling 4 average is low enough, but that cap is still there, we're capping a workload that doesn't need to be capped because we're not saving any money, right? So by doing this, if the actual MSU drops, the red line here, drops below the rolling 4 average, then the defined capacity follows the current usage, right? So at that point, the automation of the caps matches the actual usage, right? And so it frees up the white space here that you can use for other workloads or test, dev, whatever you want to give that to, right? So the SCRT will take the lower of the 2 values, the R4HA or the defined cap. So the user will not notice the capping because there's no limitation. The capping is following the actual usage. So basically you're getting, I don't want to say capacity for free, but you are using capacity that you would ordinarily not use because of the way you've got your caps set up. All right, outsource customers. So there's all kinds of outsource contracts. It can be an all-you-can-eat. It can be, could be, similar to IBM's pricing model. You pay per MSU. It could be, we'll give you 1,000 MSUs a month, and you pay this price, a fixed price contract type of thing. So you can use up to that amount, but you don't pay less if you use less than that, right? So DCI, for outsource customers, there's a couple of ways that the tool provides value. Not going to go into a lot of detail here about that, but it could be things like just keeping your outsourcer honest. It could be, making sure that you're actually getting the capacity that they say you're getting. There's a lot of things that we could do there. All right. So all those things that I talked about before, right? Defined capacity limits and group capacity limits. All those things, those 3 things that it can do, and those things that it can't do, and then we notice that all those check marks appear for DCI. So at this point, I'm going to pause for any questions. I've been talking really fast, and my throat's kind of dry. Somebody please ask me a question. Okay. Yes.
Adjustment of the priorities, the adjustment of the capacities, can that be overridden manually?
So the question is can the adjustment, the automation of the defined capacity limits, can those be overridden? The answer is yes, they can be overridden. So when you go to the 3270 and you put in the override, but there is a requirement to that. It's going to ask you how long you want to override it, right? So if you put in, 1,440 hours or something, that's equivalent to a day, I think, in the back of my head. So if you put that number in, it's going to put that override in for 1,440 hours. If you don't put in a value, we ignore your override. And the reason for that is because a lot of people tend to go in there and set an override and walk away from it and forget about it, right? So who knows when you're going to remember that you put that override in and you go back and actually take it out. So there's an expiration, we force you to put an expiration date for that override in to make sure that the environment returns back to normal, if you forget. Simulation. All right, so we have two modes in DCI. There's a simulation mode and there's an active mode. He asked me to talk about simulation mode, right? Yeah, okay. So in simulation mode, we basically, the product sets up and it does all the monitoring I talked about. And at the end of when it comes to that 5-minute window and it's going to automate a change, it doesn't actually make the change, it just, there's a list of things that says, okay, here's the changes I would have made had I were in active mode. I'm sorry? Yes, it's reporting, yeah. So if you kind of step to the next logical question, okay, so in active mode, does it tell me what changes it makes, right? The answer is yes. It will report any automated capacity movement it makes, or capacity limiting. If it changes the caps, it'll tell you.
Presumably then it can only tell you once, because once it would have made those changes, the picture would have changed. For the next time it's going to report what changes it's going to make. See what I'm saying?
So I'm not sure I follow, but let me repeat it. So the question is, it will only show you the change once, because once it makes the change, the caps are changed, and so for the next time it comes around to that 5 minutes, the picture would be different, right? It would be a different environment, different caps. Yes, I mean, there would be the historical log of the changes that it made in the past, but when it comes to the next 5-minute period, yeah, the caps are different. So it would look at those caps and it would tell, if it leaves that cap alone that it changed before, yeah, you wouldn't see anything in the log or in the picture. But if 10 minutes later it does change that cap again, then the line would, the report would show that change to the cap that you had previously changed. So it's, yes, the environment 5 minutes ago is not the environment today. Does that answer the question? Did I track it? Okay. All right, anything else? Yes.
I saw in one of your slides that you have agents that run on each LPAR and they report to a director. Where does the director run? How does that, what kind of application?
Okay, so the question was, in one of my graphics, there was agents on every LPAR, and each one of those agents reported its data to a controller, right? His question is, where does that controller reside? That controller can reside anywhere in your environment. We highly recommend that it's on a DR, highly available LPAR, but it could be anywhere. ZOS. Yeah, so we're all, good question. His question is ZOS or Z Linux, Linux on Z. We do not manage capacity for ZVM or for Linux on Z. It's just ZOS. Any other questions? Very good questions. Thank you very much.
Standard IBM Prism HyperDispatch.
So we work through the standard BCPI API, so that interface. So it's no black magic. It's working through the standard APIs. So the question is there any thought for doing it for Linux and ZVM? So I would say currently no, but I would love to talk to you because I kind of struggle with why you would want to do that, because IFLs are all you can eat. Oh, okay. Oh, okay. All right, so let's move on. All right, so kind of a review. we're trying to provide a tool that gives you better economics in your environment, right? So just about every company we talk to, it's all about cost savings. Do more with less, do more with nothing in some cases, right? So we're trying to give you a tool to automate your capacity, to manage your capacity, so that you can meet your SLAs, right? So that you can optimize that capacity usage, and you can get control of your MSU, or your MLC costs, sorry, right? So these are our challenges, and we're trying to give you these outcomes. We want to give you achievable SLA objectives. We want to give you automated capacity optimization, and we want to give you that predictable, transparent budgeting tool that can allow you to see what's going on in your environment, that graphic, that picture. So what are the things that CA Dynamic Capacity can do in your environments, right? It can move MSU where you need it, when you need it, right? It's not a fire and forget thing where it looks at a definition once and never looks at it again, or never deviates from that definition. It's dynamic, right? So we want to improve your SLA management for critical workloads. We want to repurpose MSU for other things. We want to allow you to avoid unplanned peaks in capacity, right? Nobody likes to see that bill at the end of the month where they saw a peak they weren't expecting. And we want it to be easy to use and easy to install.